Who doesn't like speculating about various what-ifs of history? What if this event hadn't happened, or had happened later, or earlier, or if this person hadn't existed, or if that invention hadn't been made, etc., etc. One of the most common questions I've heard and read is, why didn't they do XYZ earlier? Like, why wasn't this type of sword invented earlier? Why wasn't this armor developed earlier? Or whatever. They would have definitely benefited from it. Yeah, why didn't those silly buggers figure out the thing that took several more centuries to develop? I mean, it's obvious in hindsight, right? People often wonder, what would the world be like if gunpowder had never been invented, or explosives in general? I want to think the opposite direction. Could it have happened earlier? Could firearms have been developed earlier than they were? So it was already earlier than many people are aware of. I mean, you might know that it originated in China. Black powder was developed either in the mid or late 9th century during the late Tang Dynasty. Chinese scientists, if you want to call them that, or alchemists, experimentalists, anyway, were experimenting with potassium nitrate, aka saltpeter, in an attempt to find life-extending medical concoctions. Together with sulfur and charcoal, it turned out that the mixture would be volatile and combust violently when exposed to an open flame. One text mentions that it burned the entire house down when that first happened. There's a popular misconception that while the Chinese invented black powder, they only used it for fireworks until the Europeans came along and invented guns, but that's not true. The Chinese had already weaponized black powder in the 10th century in the form of so-called fire lances. Those were basically spears with a flamethrower attachment, or perhaps a crude shotgun sort of thing. The oldest cannon might have been made as early as the 12th century in China, but they were definitely in use by the 13th century at least. The oldest surviving example is the Heilongjiang hand cannon, I probably mispronounced that, from 1288. Of course, whenever you make such an explosive discovery, other people's interest in it might go ballistic. Yeah, I'll stop now. So gunpowder came over to Europe probably through the Silk Road trade in the 14th century. The oldest known depiction of a cannon in Europe is from 1326 or 27. So all in all, Europeans were at least about a century late with their guns. Much can happen in a century, of course, at least at this stage of human history. 100 years during the Stone Age would be absolutely nothing. But could this consequential discovery have been made even earlier? It's quite possible. One thing I found is a Sanskrit text, which I don't know how to pronounce properly, from ancient India, which, depending on who you ask, is between 2,200 and 1,700 years old. It mentions the use of saltpeter as toxic smoke in warfare. I couldn't confirm whether sulfur was commonly used in India at that time, but I would assume so. I mean, it was already used in ancient Mesopotamia. The Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans knew of it too, and the latter also used potassium nitrate or saltpeter as a fertilizer. And of course, charcoal is the easy part. You just burn some wood for long enough in a kiln. So could they have discovered gunpowder in India much earlier? Well, potentially. The Greeks might have been able to do it earlier too. You've probably heard of Greek fire, first created in 627. Nasty stuff used to set ships on fire and people, and it was impossible to extinguish. Sailors on fire would jump into the water and it wouldn't help. They would continue burning. That must be one of the absolute worst ways to go. And of course, the Greeks worked a lot with bronze. The earliest cannons, or cannon? I've actually looked this up at one point, whether you put an S for the plural or not. I haven't found a definitive answer. So you can say either cannon or cannons. Could they have made a bronze cannon? If they were to cast what is essentially just a thick-walled tube that is closed off on one side, that might be possible. The problem would potentially be the touch hole, the access point where you ignite the powder. The touch hole or vent would have been extremely difficult for them to drill into such a thick piece of bronze, so they would have probably had to incorporate the hole into the mold and then cast it that way, which might be the weak point. And in fact, from what I can gather, that was a common problem in medieval guns too, so it might start to rupture from that weak spot. But I imagine they could perhaps have figured that out at a much earlier point in history. Where there's a will, there's a way. Even wooden cannons have been made. Not exactly durable, but possible. Whenever it comes to questions of why didn't they do it earlier, you have to consider not only the technological side and the, I guess, material conditions overall, what resources they had available, how many people were interested in science or proto-science, how much leisure time basically you could spend on experimenting with things rather than just focusing on, matters of everyday survival or warfare or whatever. There's of course a bunch of factors like that go into it. And then also culture and mindset. In some cases you might just not be predisposed toward a certain discovery because of the predominant cultural norms and worldview and all of that at the time. Now, the Greeks were focused on torsion-based weaponry. The catapult, the ballista, the gastrophes type crossbow. Combustion-based propulsion was not necessarily on their mind, although, interestingly, over 2,200 years ago, Archimedes designed a steam cannon, apparently, which was a large copper tube capped on one end, which would be loaded with a projectile and heated to a very high temperature, and then you would fill water behind the projectile, and then the quick vaporization would launch it. At least that was a concept. Who knows if that was ever successfully done, but that was the idea, which is quite interesting. So I could definitely imagine in a parallel Earth sort of setting that the Greeks would have had firearms already in the 5th century maybe, or 6th or 7th, maybe even earlier, maybe much earlier. And then of course everything would have panned out a little bit differently. A lot of things could have been made earlier that weren't dependent on technology as much. Some things, of course, you need better metallurgy for. I mean, there's a reason why armor gradually evolved. It's not that they wouldn't have liked a full suit of plate in the early Middle Ages, like say in the 10th century or 11th. It's just that they weren't quite ready yet to do that. Whereas other things, I don't really see a reason why they couldn't have made complex hilts, for example, in the early Middle Ages. They might not have been as durable as 15th or 16th century made complex hilts, but it would have been doable, I'm reasonably sure. It's just that they didn't think of it and didn't see the need for it. There were, of course, plenty of factors, like, for example, the use of shields makes you not as vulnerable in the hands. Wearing gauntlets rather than using complex hilts is, of course, also an option. There's always several different answers to the same problem, and at different points in time, they preferred different answers. And then the further back you go in time, the longer it took to figure certain things out. Particularly in Paleolithic times. I mean, the time spans are enormous. You don't have any significant large-scale change for thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years. Even the idea to make tools by grinding stone rather than knapping it was extremely recent. Right? If you look at human history overall, you have this enormously long time period where nothing happened. Obviously not nothing. If you ask people back then, they would tell you about plenty of important events, that were important to them. But as far as the archaeological record is concerned, essentially nothing changed for an incredibly long period of time. And then things started to pick up, and development, or the rate of development, accelerated more and more and more until eventually a mere 100 years make a huge difference. They could have found copper earlier and worked with it and then messed around with that to eventually come up with bronze, etc., etc. They could have, they just didn't, for whatever reason. Those reasons are naturally fascinating to speculate on, and we can think about all kinds of alternate timelines, but there are very few clear answers, as far as I see, as to why something wasn't done earlier. Even if you say, well, they didn't have the technology at the time, in a lot of cases, there were not necessarily ironclad barriers. Anyway, before I ramble too much, let me know what you think on this topic. I hope you found it interesting. Just something that I felt like talking about at the time. And thanks for watching. Appreciate it. Take care, folks.